Welcome to BigTent USA. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Susan Lehman, and I'm delighted to host this evening's discussion with Judy Woodruff and Sarah Longwell. Kitty Douglas will join to moderate the Q&A halfway through. We are thrilled to see so many friends here. Our tent is growing. At BigTent USA, we put democracy above partisanship. We are a national women-led voter coalition dedicated to protecting democracy, women's reproductive rights, and our children and our grandchildren's future through education and civic engagement. I am thrilled to introduce you to our guests. We welcome back Sarah Longwell under the tent. She is a Republican political strategist whose work focuses on defending American democracy from the dictator-like threat posed by MAGA Republicans. As a founder of the Republican Accountability Project, Sarah supports Republicans who stand up for democracy and works to hold election deniers accountable. She founded Defending Democracy Together in 2018 with Bill Kristol to defend America's democratic norms, and she is a publisher of The Bulwark and host of the must-listen podcast, The Focus Group. Judy Woodruff is a senior correspondent for PBS NewsHour. She has covered politics and other news for over 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. At PBS, she was the chief Washington correspondent for the McNear-Lear NewsHour and anchored the PBS award-winning documentary series Frontline with Judy Woodruff. At CNN, she served as anchor and senior correspondent for the weekday program Inside Politics, and she returned to PBS NewsHour, and in 2013, she and the late Gwen Ifill were named the first 2 women to co-anchor a national news broadcast. At a time of heightened partisanship, declining trust in institutions, increased political violence, and rapid social change, as senior correspondent for PBS, Judy set out this year on a 2-year reporting project, America at a Crossroads. She explores the forces driving Americans apart and to ask people from all walks of life and all political persuasions what might be done to reverse these trends. Judy is a graduate of Duke University, where she is a trustee emerita, and as an I am alum of Duke as well. I am especially honored to welcome Judy Woodruff to BigTent. Thank you both for being here. Sarah, passing it over to you.
Great. Hey, everyone. It's great to be back on. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm especially happy to be here with my good friend, Judy Woodruff.
I'm the one who's happy.
No, we're both happy. Here's what you should know about me and Judy. Judy has this great show, America at a Crossroads, where she goes out and talks to voters. I do a lot of focus groups where I talk to voters and have now for years. And sometimes we join up and I will do focus groups, and Judy and her production team will come and film them, and we'll travel together. We'll talk to voters together. And so, we collaborate from time to time, and it's the best. And we share, I think, a mutual fascination and interest in what is driving politics right now through voters. And that's what your show is really about. Judy, just talk a little bit about why you started America at a Crossroads.
I will do that, but first I have to say I've tried really hard to bring Sarah out of her shell. I'm still working on it. Sarah, you're doing a whole lot better than you were. No, in all seriousness, America at a Crossroads is a project that I came up with as I was preparing to step away from the anchor desk at the NewsHour at the end of 2022. I knew I wanted to continue reporting, and frankly, I wanted to get out of Washington. I've lived here for more than 40 years. I love the city, and I've learned a lot in the city, but I feel there's something missing in my knowledge as a reporter and my understanding of the country. And I saw America, and still do see America, as more divided than I've ever seen it in my 50 plus years of covering American politics. I've never seen us as far apart as we are on the issues. Sarah, you and I have talked about this, but not only that, how frankly, how dark and how much darker our views are of people in the other party. And I wanted to try to understand that. And so since the first of 2023, my team and I have been, as you just said, going around the country, interviewing ordinary Americans, interviewing community leaders, some academics, folks who've done a lot of research on this. And we've been very lucky when we've been able to be able to use your services, Sarah, as the moderator when we've sat down with groups of voters. So it's been a journey. We're still on it. We still have 8 months to go, and a lot of places we want to visit.
So, you just said, it's dark, we're divided. When you get out on the road and you talk to voters, does it make you feel better or worse about America and our crossroads? Like, are you more optimistic after you talk to voters, or does it bring you down?
Both. There are places we go where we find groups with so-called bridging groups that are working really hard to get people to sit down together, just to listen to each other, to respect the other point of view long enough to try to at least have a conversation. But I will tell you, Sarah, those are mainly at the grassroots level right now. They're at the local level. They are wonderfully well-motivated efforts. There are groups like Braver Angels, Common Ground, Starts With Us. We've profiled a group, in fact, in Tennessee called Starts With Us that tried very hard to bring Tennesseans together over gun issues after a terrible school shooting. They were not successful, or they haven't been successful so far in getting the state legislature to do anything about what they were able to get citizens to do. So we see these efforts in states and communities, but I have to say that by and large, there's still a lot of division out there. I know people tell me, Sarah, there's a lot of people in the middle who feel their voices are not being heard, and they want to know why we're not talking to them. We are trying to talk to them as well, but we're also picking up a lot of, frankly, really hard feelings on both sides. And I want to ask you, Sarah, because you in doing these focus groups for the last few years have been trying to do much of the same thing, trying to understand where people are coming from. Tell me, do you feel you're able to get to that with these focus groups?
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about getting out of Washington, because one of the reasons I started doing the focus groups was when Trump got elected, it was like, well, how is this possible? And it made me feel unmoored, both from the Republican Party, but also from America. And so when I started doing the groups, I guess it's when I sort of realized I had spent too much time in think tanks, in part because, and when you say this thing that you just said about how people are like, well, there's this exhausted majority that really want to work together and find common ground. That is like a very Washington thing to say, because we sort of assume that that's what people want. Like, that's a thing we say to each other. It's not, I think, quite true. People are not that exhausted. They're quite animated, actually, by a lot of the things that make them angry and upset. Trump's understanding why Trump was elected and understanding it through the prism of grievance is, look, there's a lot of prisms through which you can look at it, through immigration and the way people were feeling at immigration. But like, if you take grievance writ large, that's a pretty good frame to understand why people were willing to sort of tear things down and take a shot on somebody like Donald Trump. And so I think that we in Washington should be careful about assuming everybody wants a kind of, can't we all just get along centrism, because it's not quite true. It doesn't mean that there's not big things that bind us. It doesn't mean that there's not a big common story that you can appeal to sometimes. But I just think we have to be honest about the fact that there is, since the rise of social media, there's also been the rise of what I would call conflict entrepreneurs, people who really feed off of tearing us apart. And Donald Trump is the biggest conflict entrepreneur I've ever seen, and he's ascended to the highest levels of our politics. And these are people who, as a vocation, work to drive us apart, and they understand that some of the biggest motivating emotions in people are fear and anger. And so they appeal to that fear and anger all the time. And as a result, we've got a voting population that's pretty scared and pretty angry.
And I think, no, go ahead.
Yeah, no, please.
Finish your thought. No, I was just going to say that I think the media plays a big role in this. And I guess it goes without saying, because I've worked in media for as long as I have. I'm part of that mix. I like to think that the PBS NewsHour is the exception to the rule, because we try to cover all sides. We try not to buy into this everything is about conflict notion. But the truth is, so much of the national media today, and this is exacerbated by, of course, by the internet, by social media, where you can stir the pot so quickly. You can say really nasty things about other people without adding your name and without being held accountable in any way. And we know that so much of the media, commercial media, is about clicks. It's about eyeballs. It's about how many people are watching, listening, following. And to the extent that conflict drives followership or viewers and sells advertising, gets the numbers up, you're right. I mean, there is clearly an effort to capitalize on that. I don't think that's all that's driving our partisanship, but there's no question it's stirring the pot. But again, you and I have talked about this. It goes back in time. A few decades ago, we started to see the parties get, frankly, more and more opposite in the way they talked about each other, and it's only grown more so since I would say, especially since the early '90s.
So when you're out on the road and you're talking to people, like how are you choosing where you go, what stories you tell? Like what are you looking to get? So like what are you thinking about and how you're choosing to get out into America?
Well, our overall goal is truly to try to understand what's going on. What's at the source of this division? Do people really like it? Do they feel comfortable with the fact that, families can't even sit together over the Thanksgiving dinner table, or that some neighbors are building fences so they don't have to interact with the person next door, that people are unfriending other people? Or would they like to see that change? So that's our goal, is to try to get to the bottom of what people are thinking. Having said that, we decided we wanted to be geographically diverse. So we've been to 20 plus states already, I think 21 states so far in the District of Columbia. We have talked to people from one end of the political spectrum to the other. We've tried to talk, of course, to women and men. We've tried to be diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, age, and all those things. But there's also been a personal element. For example, one of the first pieces we did, Sarah, is I went to the place where I was born, Tulsa, Oklahoma. I only lived there for 5 years. I was an Army brat. We moved overseas when I was just a little girl. But Tulsa is the site of, over 100 years ago, a terrible race massacre, 1921, when a group of white Tulsans went and burned down what was called the Black Wall Street of Tulsa, the Greenwood neighborhood. There were hundreds of people who died. For decades and decades after that, Tulsa buried that story. I wanted to go back and see, how is this city with a young Republican mayor dealing with this? It turns out he's trying in many ways, trying to talk about that history, trying to talk about healing. How do we heal as a community? He's feeling pressure both from the right in Tulsa, the conservative groups who want to not teach all of frankly, the troubled history in the state of Oklahoma and across the country, for that matter. And then on the other hand, there are those on the left, including the Black community, who want a whole lot more said and done about what happened. And so we wanted to try to understand at the local level, how are leaders dealing with this? So we're looking not just, Sarah, at the national picture, but also at the local picture, and then trying to understand, how does that inform what people think about the national picture. I just will say finally here that we found a number of people citing what's going on in Washington as a justification for their views of what is happening in their local community. Not always, but Washington does feed into so often what's happening at the community level.
Yeah, I remember when you and I were I can't remember if it was when we were in Pennsylvania or one of the other groups, but we asked the voters that we were talking to who they blamed for the division. And they said the media, like all together at once in unison. They blamed the media. Is that, you just mentioned it too, but like, what do you think is at the root of the division?
Such a great question. And I'm still trying to figure it out. I have to say, this has been a humbling experience. I learn every day, but there's a whole lot I don't know. I think that was by the way, I think that was a group of Iowa Republican two-time
it was
Trump
Iowa.
voters.
That's right.
You
Good
were the
memory.
moderator of that fascinating group, and we should talk some more about what we learned from that session. I mean, to me, Sarah, it's a number of things. It is a holdover from the kind of division that we started to see in the '90s. It was exacerbated after the election of President Obama. Then we had the Tea Party movement, and then of course the appearance of Donald Trump. And I think it's clear the division has accelerated since then, but there's so much more. I think part of it is economic. There's a sense on the part of many Americans that they've been left out of whatever economic advances have been made, that they feel forgotten and frankly disrespected by Washington and by many of their colleagues. I remember I've talked to Republicans around the country, Trump supporters, who say they feel dissed or disrespected by friends, neighbors, family members, who they say they don't respect me. They think they look down on me. They say, you know, they would say things like, we're not all racist. We're not racist. So there's clearly that feeling going on the part of Democrats. There's a sense that how could the other side possibly have the views that they have? It's incomprehensible to me that they would support Donald Trump or support or be so antagonistic toward immigrants, toward migrants, and on down the list. But I think it's complicated. I mean, on down, I would also say that issues like immigration clearly do play a role. Some people feel very strongly about that. I think there is research that shows education may play some role, but I don't think that's clear. To me, that's not clear. I haven't seen any reporting or research that convinces me that there's a bright line when it comes to education. So I want to turn that back to you, because what are you seeing? You often will split up your focus groups into those with a high school education, those with a college degree. What do you see?
So I've seen a big, I do think there's sort of a diploma divide when it comes to how I think about who is moving politically. So I talk a lot about how we're in the middle of a political realignment, and that Trump sort of scrambled and accelerated that. And so we've got a lot of these college educated voters. Everybody sort of says shorthand, college educated suburban voters. That's true. It tends to be in these outer rings around metropolitan areas. And those voters voted for John McCain and Mitt Romney, and they are increasingly willing to vote for Democrats in large parts. One of the things that people are always surprised by, but it makes sense once you think about it, is the most movable voters in this election are likely going to be white voters, 65 and older. And you're like, boy, doesn't that sound like Trump's demographic? But those are actually the voters who remember Ronald Reagan, who joined the Republican Party because they cared about limited governments, free markets, American leadership in the world. And they don't connect with the Donald Trump's version of the Republican Party. Maybe they held their nose and voted for him a couple of times, waiting for, the normal party to come back. And now as they see that it's not, these are the people who are moving out of the Republican Party. While at the same time, there's a lot of young voters who traditionally, like, if you are a young Republican today, you came because of Trump, right? You want that version of the party, and they have no connection. They don't understand why anybody would vote for Nikki Haley. They don't understand why people talk about her as a Republican. They're like, that's not the party I'm interested in. I'm interested in the Trump populist. I mean, they don't say populist, but that is the party that they're interested in, the one that they view as anti-establishment. But I want to go back, actually, sorry, just really quickly, to this idea of when we open every focus group, we ask people how things are going in the country. They're relentlessly negative about how things are going in the country, just to left, right, and center. People are very negative. But one of the things people say all the time is that we're too divided. Like, they lament the division. They are sad that we're so divided. People talk in the focus groups all the time about their relationships. And it's funny, sometimes people ask, with Donald Trump, why do people stick with him? And I talk about sunk costs, like the number of people who've already, like, their relationship with their sister is over and it's long gone and like it's not coming back. The sunk costs of Trump are very real. And so sometimes people are like, I've already done this. I've already lost everything I'm going to lost. And I'm not admitting I'm wrong. I'm not admitting he lost, because that gives too much satisfaction to these people. People are dug in this way. And yet there's this human part of them that's like desperate to not be this divided. And it's both in there. And I believe pretty strongly that leadership matters a great deal, that we all have sort of light and dark inside of us, and good impulses and bad impulses. And the one that gets the most attention, right, the one that is fed, is the one that becomes dominant. And I think Donald Trump has really fed in our politics all of the worst impulses, and that has, again, going back to the fear and anger, and sowed this division in a way that it's going to actually take a leader, I think, post-Trump, who makes a really concerted effort to remind us of the things that bind us together as Americans in order to get us out of that. But that's just my theory.
Yeah, I think I often ask people, who can you think of who's on the horizon anywhere right now who could bring the American people together? And often the answer is silence. We haven't done a segment, we haven't done a piece on that, but I'm struck by that. Sarah, I don't know if you remember, but the focus group you did with us in Iowa, among other things, you asked two-time Trump voters. First of all, you asked them, do they have friends who were Democrats? And then you asked them, what would they think if their child dated or then married a Democrat? And there was a woman who, unforgettably to me, I mean, I still remember her face when she said this. She said, my daughter did. It didn't go well. And people kind of smiled then, but then she said, we're now estranged. So there was a lot of pain in that answer. And Sarah, I mean, just that same focus group was the one where you asked, again, two-time Trump voters, whether they thought it was possible to be a Democrat and to be a person of faith, a Christian of deep faith. And everyone in that particular focus group said to you, no, they didn't think it was possible. And they went on and described why, and it had to do with abortion. It also had to do with gender issues. I think one of them I know said, God knows what gender we are when we're born. It's not possible to change that. And then when we, a few weeks later, not a few days after that, went to Democratic voters in Pennsylvania and shared that reaction with them, they were shaking their heads saying, that's ridiculous. How could they possibly believe that?
That was an amazing moment when we talked to the Democrats and said, we were talking to this Republican group and they don't think Democrats can be Christians. And there was sort of a sputtering, but I don't even understand and I remember trying to explain it, that it was around the trans issue and around issues of abortion. And that was because it was also could Biden be a good Catholic? And the Republican voters said no, they didn't believe that Biden could legitimately be a person of faith based on his political positions. I do think that that's getting at sort of some of the real things that are dividing us, which is, it's not quite dehumanizing, but it is a way of seeing our political adversaries as not being able to have the qualities. We don't think the out group is able to share the qualities that the in group is able to share. And that makes us more alienated from each other. Because it used to be that, you might have different politics, but you could be bonded as Christians, bonded as Americans, bonded as the bigger.
You had something in common.
That's right.
But when you believe the other party is filled with people who you believe are immoral, dishonest, and not that they're incapable of being people of deep faith, that's, how do you bridge that divide? And so when I ask people, who can you think of, who's out there on the horizon who you think could bring this country together? And there's often silence. People don't have an answer. And so getting back to the point you made a minute ago, Sarah, you said a lot of people raised with you, or many people raised with you, why are we so divided? And I don't like it. I don't like the fact that we're divided. And yet I get the sense that many people aren't in the mood for compromise. They've listened to Washington. They've heard their political leaders say, hey, compromise is a dirty word. We don't want to give in. And so that's where we are.
This is such a good point. So I did a whole episode about this on the Focus Group podcast around Congress. And it was so interesting to listen to voters say, I want them to get stuff done. I want this done and this done and this done. And then they said, and I don't want them to compromise with the other side, right? They did not see compromise and results, or they didn't see the results as needing compromise as the mechanism to get those results. They see it as you dig in harder, you fight harder, which is why there's this interest in sort of, they wouldn't call this, but we see the authoritarian strongman sort of interest. And it comes from the fact that they want results without compromise. And that's how you get to authoritarianism. Maybe I'm overstating it, but I think that's a piece of it.
Well, I did hear, I listened to a little bit of Marjorie Taylor Greene on the House floor late this afternoon, where she was attempting to replace Speaker Mike Johnson. Of course, she didn't have the votes to do that, but her bill of particulars had to do with he was compromising too much with the Democrats, going along with the Democrat, as she describes it, the Democratic agenda. Sarah, one of the other thing I want to raise with you is when we talked about the news media, I think one thing that is contributing to our division is the terrible collapse of local journalism. And we now have research that shows when local news goes away, people don't know what their neighbors are up to. They don't know who's running for city council. They don't know what issue, maybe what bond issues coming up. They don't, there's just so much they don't know about their neighbors, their city, their community. And then they turn, the scholars tell us, we interviewed a couple of academics who've looked at this. The scholars tell us they turn to national news, which gets back to what you were saying earlier. So much of national news is about conflict, it's about division, and it feeds that sense that either you're on one side or you're on the other side. And frankly, you're able less to participate in the civic life of your community because you don't know as much. They've now done studies that show people vote less, or they vote more on party lines. They know less about who's running when they've lost their local newspaper. What is it? Something like 2,500 newspapers have shut down over the last decade and a half. Tens of thousands of reporters have been laid off. I'm kind of on a tear right now about what's happened to local journalism in the country. And I hope that's something that I know that it's something that folks are working on. There are a number of groups that are trying to shore up through philanthropy and other methods, trying to shore these local news organizations up.
I'll just say I just got done doing a bunch of groups, a bunch of focus groups specifically around democracy and election denialism. And so I was looking at, I've seen it hundreds of times. You see the same number. 70% of Republicans believe the election was stolen. 30% believe it was on the up and fair. So I was like, I want to talk to that 30% and understand what it is that makes that 30% not believe the election was stolen when the majority of the Republican Party does. The number one thing that we found that they had in common was that they had a mixed media diet where they might watch Fox News, but they also watched a ton of local news. It was their local news that grounded them. And so the people who their media diet consisted of Fox News and then went further right into sort of right-wing podcasts and Steve Bannon or whatever, like those people were quite radicalized by that. But if you went the other way and you bounced around, some of it was like a natural curiosity. I want to see what CNN's saying, but mostly they watched local news. And that was the big differentiator in them not believing the election was stolen.
Exactly. I mean, that exactly makes my point. And it's not just making my point. I mean, the fact is, if you are just listening to one version of the news and you don't get, frankly, the straight story, then you are going to be going down rabbit holes. You're going to be picking up conspiracy theories, whether it has to do with election not being legitimate or any number of other things. I've interviewed people over the last few months who relayed to me, for example, things that they said did absolutely happen on January the 6th, when we know, because of the reporting and the research that's been done since then, that those things didn't happen on January the 6th. And I won't go into all the detail, but the point is, it's exactly what you just said, that people need a mixed diet of news. And believe me, I don't underestimate how difficult that is these days, because there's so much news out there. We are swimming in a sea of news, and yet getting accurate, vetted, checked out news takes a little bit more work, takes a little bit more time.
One last question before we go into the audience questions that I'm just curious about, because, getting people to talk to you honestly is hard. The way that we do it in the focus groups, actually, like the thing that we figured out was you never put people together with people, like we don't put Democrats and Republicans together. We are not trying to start a fight. You put people in a space they feel safe with, people that they feel like they can be honest with. And so we put two-time Trump voters with other two-time Trump voters. And then oftentimes like people who are voting for Trump again or who don't want to vote for him again, so that people are like, okay, I'm mostly with like-minded people. That's how they tell us the truth. Do people tell you the truth though, just because you're Judy Woodruff? Like, are people like, I just trust you, Judy. I mean, the second I met you, I was like, I'll tell you anything, Judy Woodruff. I would tell you
Oh,
all my secrets.
well, in that case, I've got a lot of questions for you, Sarah Longwell. I hope people trust me. I certainly hope so. I mean, but I will say that in general, there is less trust of the news media today than there was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. That is a big problem for all of us, reporters, journalists, people who work in the news media. We need the trust of the American people. And it's something I know I work very hard every day to live up to. But I don't take it for granted. And I know my colleagues at the NewsHour don't take it for granted. But you put your finger on something that is an issue that people feel they're not sure they can say what they really think because they don't know how they're going to be treated and portrayed in the media.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Kitty, you want to give
Okay.
us some questions?
I would love to get your insights on how reproductive freedom, abortion bans are playing out in your focus groups and the conversations you're having, Judy, around the country, and what you think that's going to mean in 2024.
Well, I will say that there's no question that it is going to be a factor in the election. It's just clearly a factor in the election this year. But because I haven't specifically focused on that as one of the elements of our look at America's divide yet, I can't say that I've talked to voters specifically about it. I'd love for you to ask Sarah. I will say that if people have volunteered to me that is an issue for them, but often when we're talking to people, we are bringing up what's going on in their lives right at that moment. And while some women have volunteered that it's an issue to them, other women have moved on and talked about the economy, have talked about immigration. So I'm seeing a mixed picture. But Sarah, I want to hear from you because I know you've specifically asked your focus groups about it.
Yeah. So abortion is actually really interesting and sort of tricky as an issue. And the reason is this: when you ask people, and this exactly works with what Judy just said, when you ask people at the beginning of every focus group, how do you think things are going in the country? I told you people are feeling kind of dark about it. They bring up inflation, they bring up crime, they bring up immigration, cost of living, things like that, things that are top of mind to them. They don't bring up abortion that much. This was as true as in 2022 as well. However, when you introduce abortion, you mention it to them, all of a sudden, people get very animated about it. People have really strong feelings. I was just talking to a group of 2-time Trump voting women in Arizona. 3 women in the group of 9 women. 3 women in the group had abortions, and one had like a catastrophic health issue related to her pregnancy. And there was only one person in the group who was like, no, like pro-life, the way you think of like full, but women say this thing all the time. Lots of people in this group are saying it. They said, well, I'm pro-life, but I believe in a woman's right to choose. And I think before I started doing all the focus groups, I would have thought that those were incompatible, but so many people say it that now I really understand what they mean, which is like, I want a culture of life. I want us, I don't think people should use abortion as birth control, but I do not like that Roe was repealed. And when you remind me about it, right? When you increase the salience about it, I become very, I get, it like hits a big emotional spot. But if you don't, and this, so in 2022, I remember being asked, I was with 3 men. I was with Fabrizio, David Axelrod, and John Anzalone. So three guys in the pollsters, and they were all of the mind that people were talking about abortion too much, that like Democrats had talked about it too much. And I was like, you know what? I don't think so, actually. I was like, because if you don't keep it top of mind and salient, people will naturally let it drop in like their hierarchy of interests. But if you keep it salient and you connect it to other issues, in 2022, the reason that abortion and democracy were able to be such big factors is because they fused together into a picture of these candidates of overall extremism, right? They would be like, Blake Masters has a crazy position on abortion. He's an election denier and he likes the Unabomber. And like, so they all came together in this sort of one big thing around these people are too extreme to govern. And that's why so many of them lost their races. So it does matter, but you have to prosecute the case. It doesn't just happen.
And the fact that it's on the ballot in several key states is going to make a big
100%.
difference.
Love to hear from both of you how you set up these environments for Americans to feel safe to express their opinions.
I mean, for me, it's all about showing respect. It's not going in and saying I've got all the answers and I'm the know-it-all and I'm just here to, I'm going to listen, but I really know what I'm going to take away as a reporter. I go in, and this is true. I go in looking for answers. I go in asking questions like, why do you think the way you do? Where have you heard that? If someone says something that maybe doesn't compute with something else they said, I'll follow that. I'll follow up. I truly want to hear what people have to say and why, and I want to know why they believe it. And I think respecting people and truly listening to them makes all the difference in the world. And I also happen to think, I know from watching Sarah, that's how she operates. She leaves it as open as possible. She listens respectfully. And that's not always the case in our society right now. People are seeing encounters where people are just not listening to each other. They're yelling at each other. But Sarah, you can explain your approach, but I know you go in listening too.
Yeah, a lot of times people ask in the focus groups, like they find the focus groups maddening because they're like, people are saying untrue things. People are lying. They're wrong. And they're like, why doesn't Sarah push back? Why won't she tell them they're wrong? It is hard to have a podcast that I think is deeply revealing and really interesting and have a lot of people tell me it's like too painful to listen to because they just can't deal with listening to real people sort of talk about these things and like say things that aren't true. And this question about why I don't push back, though, is to me really key. I want to understand why people think the way they do, how they're thinking about it, because I am ultimately running persuasion campaigns, right? I need to understand what these 10 people think so that I can go convince 10 million people, and persuade them on the thing I want to do. But so I am genuinely interested in every facet of how they have come to the conclusions that they've come. It's not my job in the room to tell them that they're wrong or to push back. Now I can prod and gently try to figure out, but mostly I want to be on their side because they feel that. People know whether they're a specimen that's just being turned over or whether you're having a conversation, you're genuinely interested in what they want to say. And once they feel that and they feel like they're around other people, they feel safe enough to tell you the truth. Because that's one thing. People lie in focus groups. I think that's true. People are always calibrating, right, in social situations. But I think when you put them in a super safe space with people that are like-minded, they feed off each other because they're getting positive feedback and they tell you the truth. Which is what I want to know so that I can go figure out where are the hinge points for persuasion.
I would love to we got a couple questions around race and how race is impacting how people are feeling.
Sarah's the one who's doing the survey, has seen the survey. She's doing the survey. She's doing the focus group. So I'm going to defer to her on this. I will say that in the interviews that we've done with Black voters, and I mentioned the Tulsa story a little while ago, much of their motivation is around, at least again at the local level, is around a sense that their priorities have not been recognized, and we do see some evidence that a number of them are not feeling, how do I put this, that anyone's arguing for them enough at the national level. But and when it comes to Latinos, I'm in the middle right now of reporting a piece, so I'm hesitant to jump to make any concluding kind of statements. But I will say this, that the Latino vote is very divided right now across America. I couldn't begin. I know it's expected. Sarah, you can confirm this. I think they're saying it's going to be 15-16% of the overall turnout expected to be in November, and former President Trump is going to get a chunk of that vote. It's not automatic that it's all going to be Democratic, and the question is, how how much can Democrats count on? What do they need to be saying? Immigration is such a divisive issue. There are many Latinos who very much want the border controlled. But Sarah, I want to hear from you about what you're finding.
So we've done a lot of focus groups with Hispanic voters, a lot of focus groups with Black voters, and there's so much going on here that it's like we could really just talk about just this for an hour. I would say my top line is that I'll give you one example that can maybe illuminate something. So recently, Donald Trump did this weird thing where he was selling sneakers. And then he was telling people, just saying out loud, and I think Black people are going to vote for me more because I have a mug shot and they can relate to it. And I don't know about you guys, but I heard that and went, well, that's so incredibly racist. Why would a Black person vote for Donald Trump? But I asked this group of Black voters, like, what do you think? Do you think Donald Trump's racist? No, Donald Trump's not racist. They were like, Donald Trump knows what it's like to get targeted by the police. And, he knows what it's like to have people out for you all the time and to not be treated fairly because of who you are. And the other thing that's clear in these groups, and it's not that this is unique to Black voters and Hispanic voters. It's that these Black and Hispanic voters sound an awful lot like white Trump voters to me. Like, they sound very similar. They think Trump is funny. They think his makes politics more accessible and interesting. They also have a real sense of, hey, I want things to be prosperous for myself. And I think that Donald Trump is a better person to make this country prosperous. They do not feel connected to Joe Biden around just like age. Like I remember a young person, she said such a funny thing. It was like, and this was like a young Democrat who was going to vote for Biden, but she was like, he's like the same age as my grandma. And my grandma has a lot of really problematic views and says a lot of problematic things. So I just don't feel that, I feel like maybe he has them too. Like, if you are 28, Joe Biden is like, you just do not connect with this guy. And Donald Trump, people still underestimate how much his celebrity just plays into it. People feel like they know him. And I don't say this to like freak people out. I've been trying to get at what it is that people like about him. They're not paying attention to all of the things. They're not dug in. And honestly, it's healthy to not live and breathe politics all the time. They're not crazy for not doing it. But as a result, they get this very superficial, like, Trump seems funnier, seems cooler, seems more interesting. They talk about the age, and age is maybe just a number, but man, do people see a difference in the way they perceive Trump's energy and Biden's. They just do. I'm sorry to report that, but the media is not just obsessed with it. It's like, if they talk to voters, that's what they're hearing, because the voters all say it, all talk about it. And there is just no bigger issue for people than the economy always. What was this, Carville? Was it the economy stupid? Whoever said that, it's just still true that looms really large. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to vote that way. And look, the economy is getting better. Actually think Biden's been a pretty good steward of it, but like, these people, especially non-college, they feel an enormous pinch at the gas tank and at the grocery store every week. And it makes a big difference to them.
We talked to a couple, we went to Steubenville, Ohio, which was once this thriving steel town. And we found a couple, the husband works full time. They have 2 children. They can't afford to buy groceries. We met them at a food pantry where they were filling up a cart and big sacks of groceries to feed their family for the week. And they said they're both, I would guess they're in their 30s. And they said, under President Trump, prices were lower. Gas was lower, food was lower. We could afford more food. And that's something President Biden just has to live with. That's just the way it is right now.
I'd love to get your take on what is the message, and I'm sure it's different, but what is the message? What is the persuasion that is going to help get enough Americans to prioritize democracy or freedom or the Constitution?
As a longtime journalist and somebody who's covered politics for a long time, I'm a big fan of talking about the issues, talking about the candidates, their record, their character, not doing so much of what we call the horse race. I would like to see the media. We all love polls, you know, we're drawn to them like moths to a flame. But I think there's too much horse race coverage. I think the more we can cover who these candidates are, yes, we think we know everything about them, but let's think about, let's look really hard at what their policies are and have been and how they've affected the American people. Those are the stories that I think the news media need to be focusing on between now and November, reminding everybody what the positions are of these candidates and what the consequences of those positions are, and trying to straighten out what's fact and what's fiction, what's real and what isn't, what's propaganda and what's and made up versus what actually happened. I think the media could do a huge service by clarifying so much, because frankly, there's so much disinformation, misinformation out there that we can't do enough of that kind of work.
Do you think the media is doing a good job on a Trump 2.0, like given the Time magazine piece, or what the content of Project 2025 is? Do you feel like that story's getting out there enough, or can we do better?
I think it's getting out. I mean, there's certainly been now several pieces, interviews done with him where he's talked himself in his own words. He's spoken about what he would do as president. I think the media should put that out there. I think they should be trying to ask those questions of President Biden as well. I mean, frankly, it's President Biden, it's harder to get an interview with him than it used to be back in the days when he served in the United States Senate. It's a whole lot harder. And I think the press needs to be asking him questions. We need to be asking former President Trump questions. I think all of this needs to get out there. We need to continue every day to educate the American people about what's true, what's factual, and what isn't, so that people have something to hang on to rather than some conspiracy theory they read or picked up somewhere.
Great. All right, Sarah.
I actually
Persuasion.
Yeah, so I'll talk about, but I think that Judy, first of all, Joe Biden won the last election. So you do not have to necessarily convince, you have to hold together a coalition of people. And the biggest coalition in American politics is an anti-Trump coalition. That's your biggest, broadest coalition. It's not necessarily pro Joe Biden. It is anti-Trump. And so I think a lot about how do you hold that group together? How do you keep people from backsliding? I focus on right-leaning independents and soft GOP voters and figuring out how to persuade them to vote against their tribe, which is uncomfortable for them. And so I focus on sort of building a micro tribe, which we call Republican voters against Trump. Notably, we do not call it Republican voters for Biden. Somebody might stand that up, but I specifically frame it in the negative way because these voters are much more anti-Trump than they are pro-Biden. But you need to try to get them to vote for Trump. And I think that what was interesting, Judy just said this, and it was in the timepiece. We are not talking enough about what a Trump second term would look like. If the problem with the court cases, right? Everybody's like, well, if Trump gets convicted, what will it do? All of that stuff is looking backwards. I mean, the fact that we are talking about Stormy Daniels and stuff that was litigated, everybody who has voted for one of these guys knows about Stormy Daniels and has already dealt with that. Now, if Trump's convicted of a crime, could that matter on the margins? I believe that it can, but I also think a lot of that stuff is baked in. I think we have to start paying a lot more attention to what would Trump do on a second term. And I agree, we should know what Biden's going to do on a second term. Biden has got to figure out a way to earn people's votes and make them vote affirmatively for him and not just against Donald Trump. That is insufficient. And look, I just want to say, just as a broad matter of politics, if I could, the way that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of these voters is they're going through the five stages of grief on this election, right? You see them, there's anger about, and that's where you see Biden's low poll numbers. They're so frustrated Biden's running again. There's denial. There's can't be these two guys. We were in denial a long time. They can't possibly be these two people. There's the bargaining phase is really third parties. We'll go third party. No labels will come through. And then I think right now we're kind of in depression. And I think that when you get to acceptance, which is the final stage of grief, and you have to deal with the big persuadable group, which is something I call double haters, people who do not like either of these candidates, that the reason that I am optimistic about Joe Biden's chances, even though with all the caveats about we are in a dangerous situation and it is not looking good and all the polls are trending in Trump's direction, the fact is voters actually don't hate Joe Biden. They don't like Joe Biden. They don't want it to be him. They're not inspired by Joe Biden, but they hate Trump. And so I think that Trump ultimately loses on that. I think there's a lot of Republicans who are going to leave the top of the ticket blank. That's what I'm focused on. Leave it blank or vote for Joe Biden. And the way that we do that, just as a quick like mechanical matter, is we collect testimonials, videos from people who have voted for Trump, in many cases twice, explaining why they will not do it again. Most of the reasons that they give are because of January 6th. Sometimes it's because of abortion. Sometimes it's just the election denialism and the chaos. Like, I won't go back there. I won't do it again. But using real people as the messengers, because that's who people trust. Like, the trust in everything else is so low. The one group they do trust is people like them. And so that's who we use as our messengers. And I will say, though, you need to come at it from both ways. You need to have real people talking about why they won't vote for Trump a second time. You also need the generals and the people who worked with Trump to come out and explain why people shouldn't vote for him again. And I think that's a big piece over the next 6 months that we need to see happen. Sorry, I see we're at time and I'm just going on and on.
I'm going to turn this call over to Susan Lehman. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Judy.
Well, thank you so much, Judy and Sarah, for this essential conversation. Judy, you have said my job is to try and bring attention to places that don't have it and to report the fact-based truth. Clearly, you continue to do this with America at Crossroads. And as we've learned this evening, your work is nowhere near done. And to our amazing guest speaker, Sarah Longwell, we look forward to having you back again and continue your incredible work. To our amazing, dedicated BigTent community, thank you again for showing up every week. We are in this fight together. And borrowing a quote from Friday Night Lights, clear eyes, strong heart, can't lose. Thank you for joining us under the tent, and we'll see you soon.